Ryu Min-ho's jaw tightened as the digital timestamp on the monitor read 2:34 a.m. The air in his private surveillance room felt thin, suffocating, the silence broken only by the low hum of the servers. The blue glow from the bank of monitors cast sharp, jagged shadows across the dark tattoos climbing his neck, making the dragon's ink stained into his skin seem to ride in the low light. He watched the feed again, his eyes narrowing. There she was, Sandra Jay, the American chef he'd hired only a month ago, moving through the stainless steel expanse of his industrial kitchen like a ghost. In the grainy high-definition night vision, her movements looked guilty, furtive. She glanced over her shoulder toward the service entrance twice before wrapping a heavy thermos in a kitchen towel and tucking it swiftly under her pristine white chef's coat. Her hands were shaking. Ryu had built his reputation in the underworld on instinct, on reading the trembling weakness in men's eyes before they even knew they were going to break. He had suspected Sandra from the moment his head housekeeper came to him with the inventory reports. Premium beef bones gone, vegetables vanished. It was small, petty theft, but in Ryu's world, theft was a cancer that had to be cut out before it spread. He sighed, the sound heavy in the quiet room. He had wanted to be wrong. He actually liked her food. She was the first cook in years who understood that flavor wasn't a crime. But the camera didn't lie. She was desperate, just as the staff whispered. Probably selling his premium stock to the foreigner bars in Itaewon to pay off debts back home. Ryu leaned forward, the cold light reflecting off the face of his watch. His phone sat on the desk beside the keyboard, its weight a familiar promise of violence. This was it, the proof he needed. One phone call to his head of security, and Sandra Jay would be handled. Not killed, he wasn't a savage without cause, but she would be removed permanently, sent back to whatever city she came from with enough fear in her bones to keep her silent forever. His thumb hovered over the call button. He was ready to give the order. But something made him wait. On the screen, Sandra didn't head toward the back exit to smuggle the goods out. She didn't turn toward the staff quarters. Instead, she slipped down the hallway toward the west wing, the forbidden corridor that housed the entire third-floor suite. The one place in the estate that was strictly off-limits to everyone but the medical staff. Ryu froze. That was where his mother lay, wasting away. A red light blinked on his console. Motion detected, master suite. Ryu's finger lifted off the phone screen. "Where are you going?" he whispered to the monitor, his voice rough with sudden, cold confusion. He didn't make the call. Instead, he switched the feed to his mother's room. 3 weeks earlier, the silence in the kitchen had been loud enough to hear. Sandra Jay stood in the center of the room, clutching her knife kit like a shield. The space was massive, easily 4 times the size of any restaurant line she'd worked in back in Chicago. Stainless steel gleamed under harsh, clinical fluorescent lights. There were 2 industrial ranges, a walk-in freezer the size of a studio apartment, and prep stations that looked more like surgical theaters than places to chop vegetables. It was impressive, expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. 6 Korean kitchen staff members paused their work to stare at her. They didn't speak, but their eyes slid over her with open hostility, lingering on her skin and her hair with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. They whispered to each other in rapid-fire Korean that Sandra couldn't follow, though the tone was unmistakable. She was an intruder. A contaminant. Miss J. The voice cut through the tension like a cleaver. Sandra turned to find a woman in her 60s standing in the doorway, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it pulled at her eyes, giving her a permanent expression of severity. This was the head housekeeper, the gatekeeper of the estate. "I am the head housekeeper," she said, her English flawless but icy. "I oversee all domestic operations. You were hired because Mr. Ryu requires Western culinary options for his business associates. That is the extent of your utility." "Yes, ma'am," Sandra said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She needed this paycheck. The debt collectors back in the States didn't care about her pride. The housekeeper stepped closer, her eyes scanning Sandra for any sign of weakness. "There are rules here. You will cook what you are told. You will not explore the house. You will not speak to the family." She gestured vaguely toward the ceiling. "The master is a busy man. He is not to be disturbed." Her expression darkened as she pointed toward the service elevator. "And you are strictly forbidden from the west wing on the 3rd floor. The master's mother resides there. She is unwell." The housekeeper's lip curled slightly. She is mentally unstable and dangerous. Violent. The medical staff handles her needs. If you go near her, you will be fired immediately. Do you understand? I understand, Sandra nodded. Good. Start with the vegetables. The housekeeper turned on her heel and marched out. As soon as she was gone, the whispers started up again, louder this time. The sous chef, a stern man with a scar on his chin, shoved a crate of radishes toward Sandra without looking at her. He pointed to the corner station, the one furthest from the rest of the team. It was clear, she was here to work, but she would never belong. The routine of the kitchen was a brutal, silent ballet, but Sandra had learned the steps quickly. Keep your head down, keep your knife sharp, and never ask questions. But something about the house didn't sit right in her gut, a feeling that grew heavier with every passing shift. It started with the waste. Sandra had worked in enough kitchens to know that food got tossed, but what she saw at the Ryu estate was different. It was excessive. It was deliberate. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her employment, Sandra was scrubbing down her station when the service elevator chime echoed through the quiet room. The steel doors slid open, and the head housekeeper emerged, carrying a covered serving tray. She walked with her usual stiff, imperious gait, heading straight for the disposal area. Sandra stopped scrubbing, her hand freezing on the stainless steel counter. She wouldn't have paid it any mind, except for the way the housekeeper held the tray, lightly, carelessly, as if it were already garbage. The housekeeper stopped at the industrial trash compactor and lifted the lid. The smell of bleach and old grease wafted out. Without a moment's hesitation, she upended the tray. Sandra watched in horror as a perfect, steaming fillet of sea bass, a bowl of untouched white rice, and delicate side dishes slid into the abyss. The food hadn't been picked at. It hadn't been pushed around the plate in a fit of dementia-fueled refusal. It was pristine. It looked exactly as it had when Chef Kong had plated it an hour ago. A shame, the housekeeper said, though she wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. She noticed Sandra watching and paused, her eyes narrowing. The master's mother is difficult today. She refuses to eat. Again, Sandra gripped her sponge tighter. She didn't touch any of it. She is losing her mind, the housekeeper replied, her voice smooth, rehearsed. She imagines the food is poisoned, or she simply forgets how to swallow. It is heartbreaking, really. But as the housekeeper turned to place the empty tray on the washing pile, Sandra caught a glimpse of her face in the reflection of the warming oven. There was no heartbreak in her expression, no frustration of a caregiver at her wit's end. There was a smirk, a small, cold curl of the lip that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The housekeeper walked away, her heels clicking rhythmically on the tile. Sandra looked back at the compactor. She knew what illness looked like. She had nursed her own grandmother through the final, ugly stages of cancer. When people lost their appetite or their minds, the food came back messy, spilled, crumbled, rejected. This food hadn't been rejected. It had been withheld. The anorexia story was a lie. The mother wasn't refusing to eat, she wasn't being given the chance. It was past 2 in the morning when Sandra's conscience finally dragged her out of bed. The image of the pristine sea bass sliding into the trash compactor had replayed in her mind for hours, chasing away sleep. She needed to know. Pulling her hoodie tight against the chill of the air conditioning, she slipped out of her quarters and into the silent, cavernous hallways of the estate. The house felt different at night, less like a home and more like a fortress. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Sandra made her way to the service staircase that led to the west wing, her heart hammering against her ribs. The housekeeper's warning echoed in her ears. She is dangerous. Violent. Sandra half expected to find a monster behind the heavy oak double doors at the end of the corridor. Instead, she found only silence and the faint, sickly smell of old lilies. She pushed the door open just an inch, peering into the gloom. The room was enormous, filled with shadows and expensive mahogany furniture, but it felt abandoned. The bed was empty. Water. The sound was so faint Sandra almost missed it. It came from the corner, near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sandra stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust to the moonlight filtering through the sheer curtains. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Madame Min-ho was not a monster. She was a skeleton wrapped in silk pajamas. The elderly woman was huddled on the floor by a potted orchid, her trembling fingers scooping damp soil from the planter, trying to suck the moisture from the dirt. "Oh my God," Sandra whispered, rushing forward. The woman scrambled back, terror widening her eyes. She looked like a cornered animal, raising her thin arms to protect her face. "No, please. I'll be quiet. I promise, Bongcha, I'll be quiet." "I'm not Bongcha," Sandra said, dropping to her knees and keeping her hands visible. "I'm Sandra, the cook. I'm not going to hurt you." Madame Min-ho lowered her arms slowly. Her cheekbones protruded sharply against her papery skin, and her lips were cracked and dry. She stared at Sandra with a confusion that broke Sandra's heart. "Cook," the old woman rasped. Her gaze dropped to Sandra's hands, then back to her face. "Rice. Do you have rice?" I can get you rice," Sandra stammered. "But why?" "The trays. I saw the trays come back." "Empty," Madame Min-ho whispered, a tear tracking through the dirt on her cheek. "She brings them empty. To show me what I cannot have." She gripped Sandra's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "She says I am confused. Says I ate already. But I haven't eaten in days. She says I will eat when I sign the papers. The will. She wants the house. She wants everything for herself before my son finds out." Sandra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It wasn't dementia. It was torture. The dangerous matriarch was just a starving mother, being erased by the very woman paid to protect her. Sandra knew she couldn't take on the guards posted at the gate, nor could she outmaneuver a woman like Bongcha in a battle of wills. But she could cook, and in a house that discarded gold as if it were dust, she found her arsenal in the garbage. She waited until the kitchen was empty, the heavy silence of 3 a.m. settling over the estate. Moving quietly, she bypassed the locked pantries filled with premium Hanwoo beef and imported truffles. Instead, she went to the scrap buckets destined for the compost. There, she found treasures the arrogant kitchen staff ignored: beef knuckles stripped of meat but rich in marrow, scallion roots, radish tops, and bruised ginger. To Bongcha, this was refuse. To Sandra, it was life. She worked in the dark, using the ambient light from the appliances to guide her knife. She roasted the bones to deepen the flavor, then simmered them with the vegetable scraps in a small pot on the back burner, praying the ventilation hood would whisk the rich, savory scent away before it reached the hallways. It wasn't a gourmet meal plated for a king. It was a nutrient-dense restorative broth, thick with collagen and warmth. Pouring the liquid into a thermos she'd brought from home, she wrapped it in a towel and made the terrified trek back up the service stairs. The West Wing was quiet. When she slipped inside the room, Madame Min-ho was exactly where she had left her, sitting in the dark, waiting with a desperate kind of hope. "I'm back," Sandra whispered. The old woman didn't recoil this time. She watched with wide, wet eyes as Sandra unscrewed the cap. Steam curled into the cold air, smelling of earth and comfort. Sandra poured a small amount into the lid and held it to Madame Min-ho's lips. Slowly, Sandra murmured, her hand steadying the trembling cup. "It's hot." Madame Min-ho drank. She didn't gulp it down with the animalistic panic of the night before. She drank with a sudden, returning dignity, closing her eyes as the warmth spread through her chest. When the cup was empty, Sandra poured another, and then another, until the color began to return to the old woman's gray cheeks. "It tastes like my mother used to make," Madame Min-ho whispered, her voice stronger now, less like dry leaves rustling together. She reached out, her skeletal fingers wrapping around Sandra's warm, strong hand. "Why? Why did this for me? You could lose your job. Your life. Because no one deserves to be hungry," Sandra said simply, squeezing the frail hand back. "And because my grandmother would haunt me if I let you starve." Madame Min-ho let out a weak, watery laugh. She looked at Sandra not as a servant, or a foreigner, or a tool to be used, but as a savior. "I have a son," she said softly, looking toward the door. "He is powerful, but he is blind. You see me. You are the daughter I should have prayed for." In the dark of the prison-like room, holding hands over an empty thermos, the line between chef and employer vanished. They were just two women conspiring to keep a flickering light from going out. The resilience of the human body was an inconvenience Ms. Bongcha hadn't calculated. When the head housekeeper entered the West Wing that morning, carrying the usual tray of empty porcelain bowls to mock the invalid, she expected to find Madame Min-ho comatose, perhaps even taking her final breaths. Instead, the old woman was sitting up. She was weak, yes, but her eyes were open, tracking the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Her skin, usually the color of wet ash, held a faint, stubborn flush of life. Bongcha's grip tightened on the tray until her knuckles turned white. It was impossible. A woman of her age, deprived of sustenance for this long, should be fading, not recovering. Madame Min-ho looked at her, and for the first time in months, there was clarity in her gaze, a spark of defiance that sent a spike of cold paranoia through Bongcha's chest. Someone was feeding her. Bongcha retreated to the kitchen office, her mind racing. She pulled the inventory logs, her finger tracing the lines of the ledger with predatory focus. The kitchen staff was loyal to her, terrified into submission. They wouldn't dare. That left the variable, the outsider, Sandra Jay. Bongcha scrutinized the numbers. Sandra had been careful. She hadn't taken the noticeable cuts of meat or the expensive wine. But she had been clever, hiding her theft in the margins. The log showed an uptick in disposal, weight, bones, vegetable scraps, things that should have been thrown out but were instead unaccounted for in the trash compactor's final weight. And there were missing incidentals, a few ounces of sesame oil, a missing bag of rice. It was negligible to the untrained eye, but to Bongcha, it was the smoking gun. She didn't need the truth, she just needed a story that would trigger Ryu's rage. She found Ryu in his study, reviewing earnings reports from the docks. He looked up, his expression guarded. He hated domestic interruptions. "Master," Bongcha said, bowing low, her voice trembling with feigned reluctance. "I hesitate to bring this to you, but the integrity of this house is at stake." Ryu set down his pen. "Speak." "It is the American chef," she said, stepping forward and placing the ledger on his desk. "I have been monitoring the inventory. Expensive items have been vanishing. Premium Hanwoo beef meant for your private reserve. Imported truffles. Rare spices." Ryu's eyes narrowed. "Stealing. Selling, I suspect," Bongcha continued, her voice dripping with poison. "To the black market in Itaewon. I warned you, master. These foreigners come here with debts. They see your wealth not as something to respect, but as a resource to plunder. She smiles at you, cooks for you, and behind your back, she is stripping your larder to pay her own creditors." She watched the transformation in Ryu's face. The disappointment hardened instantly into the cold, jagged armor of betrayal. He had trusted the cook. He had welcomed her into his fortress. And in return, she had proven him a fool. "Are you certain?" Ryu asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The numbers do not lie," Bongcha said, smoothing her skirt. "She is a thief, master. And a thief in the house is a knife at your throat." Ryu stared at the leather-bound ledger on his desk, the numbers blurring into a damning indictment of his own judgment. It wasn't the cost of the missing items that enraged him. He lost more money in a bad hand of poker than the value of the missing beef and rice. It was the principle. He had allowed an outsider into his sanctuary, ignored the warnings of his oldest ally, and now he was being played for a fool. The thought made the tattoos beneath his collar itch with phantom heat. "I want her gone," Ryu said, his voice low and dangerous. "Tonight, we must be careful, Master, Ms." Bongcha cautioned, her voice smooth as silk. She stepped closer to the desk, playing the role of the prudent advisor to perfection. "If we fire her without proof, she could go to the authorities. She could claim mistreatment, discrimination. These Americans are litigious, and with your business interests, we cannot afford police scrutiny." Ryu's hand clenched into a fist on the mahogany desk. "Then what do you suggest?" "Surveillance," she said, placing a manicured hand on the ledger. "Let us install cameras, hidden ones, in the kitchen, the pantries, the service corridors. Let us catch her in the act. Once we have the footage of her stealing, we can hand her over to the police, or handle it internally, without fear of repercussion. She will have no defense." Ryu looked at her, considering. It was a cold, calculating move. It was perfect. "Do it," he said. He picked up his phone. "But I don't want cheap security store toys. I want the military-grade equipment from the warehouse. High definition, night vision, audio." Of course, Bongcha nodded, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. "I will have the technicians install them in the kitchen immediately. In the West Wing," Ryu added. Bongcha froze. The triumph stuttered in her gaze. "The West Wing, master. Surely that is unnecessary. The theft is happening in the kitchen." "You said she was dangerous," Ryu said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes hard. "You said my mother is unstable. If this thief is wandering the house at night, I want to know if she has gone near my family. I want cameras in the hallways, and I want a camera in my mother's room. But, your mother's privacy. Bongcha started, her voice tight. My mother is an invalid who doesn't know her own name, according to you, Ryu snapped. She has no privacy. She has safety. Install the cameras. Everywhere. I want to see everything. Bongcha swallowed hard, but she bowed deeply. She had no choice. To refuse would be to admit guilt. As you wish, master. She left the office, and Ryu turned his chair to look out the window at the sprawling grounds of his estate. He felt a grim satisfaction. He was tightening the noose. He thought he was setting a trap for a petty thief who stole beef bones. He had no idea he had just authorized the installation of the very instrument that would expose the slow, quiet murder happening under his own roof. Ryu held his breath, his eyes burning as he stared at the monitor. On the screen, Sandra didn't pull a weapon. She didn't open the window to signal a Confederate in the garden. Instead, she knelt beside the bed, her movements slow and reverent, like a supplicant at a shrine. With trembling hands, she unscrewed the stolen thermos. Steam obscured the camera lens for a brief second before clearing to reveal the truth. Ryu watched, his mind struggling to process the image, as the woman he had labeled a thief poured broth into the cup cap. She blew on it gently, testing the temperature against her own wrist, a gesture of such instinctive maternal care that it made Ryu's chest ache. Then, she lifted it to Madame Min-ho's lips. His mother didn't fight her. She didn't scream or strike out in the violent dementia Bongcha had described. She drank. She drank greedily, her skeletal hands clutching Sandra's wrist as if it were a lifeline. Sandra took a cloth from her pocket and wiped a drop of broth from the old woman's chin, whispering something that made his mother close her eyes in peace. The phone slid from Ryu's hand, clattering onto the desk. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. She's feeding her, Ryu whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. She's just feeding her. A cold, sick feeling uncoiled in his gut. If his mother was starving enough to drink broth from a stranger in the middle of the night, then what had happened to the dinner trays? Ryu grabbed the mouse, his knuckles white. He minimized the live feed and opened the archive. He scrolled back 6 hours. 8 hours. He stopped at 6 p.m. The footage showed Ms. Bongcha entering the room. She carried a tray with a glass of water and a bowl of porridge. Ryu leaned in. His mother reached out, her mouth moving in a plea. Bongcha didn't set the tray down. She held the water glass just out of reach. When Madame Min-ho tried to sit up, Bongcha's hand shot out, not to help, but to pinch the loose skin of the old woman's arm, hard. Ryu recoiled as if he'd been burned. On the screen, his mother flinched and fell back, crying. Bongcha laughed. He couldn't hear it, but he saw her head thrown back, the cruelty etched in every line of her face. She placed the water on the dresser, far across the room, and walked out with the food untouched. Ryu slammed his fist onto the desk, cracking the wood. A guttural sound tore from his throat, half sob, half roar. He had built an empire on protecting his own. He was the most feared man in the city, a monster to his enemies, and yet, in his own home, under his own roof, he had let the woman who gave him life be tortured by the one person he trusted. He buried his face in his hands, the tattoos on his neck damp with sweat and tears, as the image of the thief, saving his mother played on in silent, damning loops. The invitation had been a command, not a request. By 8 p.m., the grand dining hall was filled with the uneasy silence of people who knew they were walking on a knife's edge. The long mahogany table was set with crystal and silver, shimmering under the chandelier's light, but no food was served. Sandra sat at the far end, shrinking into her chair. She was the only one not in formal wear. While Ryu's lieutenants wore sharp Italian suits and the household staff wore pressed uniforms, Sandra was still in her grease-stained chef's whites, pulled directly from the prep line by a stone-faced guard. She kept her hands hidden in her lap to stop them from shaking. She knew what this was. This was a tribunal. She had been caught stealing, and this was the public execution of her character before she disappeared forever. Ms. Bongcha sat near the head of the table, radiating smug satisfaction. She caught Sandra's eye and offered a small, pitying smile, the look of a predator watching a wounded bird. The double doors opened, and Ryu Min-ho entered. The room stood as one, chairs scraping against the floor. Ryu didn't wave them down. He walked to the head of the table, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't look at Sandra. He looked at Bongcha. "Please, sit," Ryu said, his voice deceptively light. "Tonight, we discuss the health of this family. And the cancer that has been eating away at it." Bongcha nodded solemnly, shooting a vindictive glance at Sandra. "It is a tragedy, master," she said, playing her part. "But it is good to finally cut it out." "Agreed," Ryu said. He picked up a remote control from the table. "I installed cameras to find a thief. To see who was taking from me. And I did." He pressed the button. A large projection screen descended from the ceiling. Bongcha straightened, smoothing her skirt, ready to see the grainy footage of Sandra stuffing beef bones into her coat. She prepared her expression of disappointment. The screen flickered to life. But it wasn't the kitchen. It was the West Wing. The room went deathly silent. On screen, high-definition footage showed Ms. Bongcha standing over the bed. The time stamp was from yesterday evening. The Bongcha on screen didn't look like the poised woman at the table, she looked like a tyrant. She laughed as she poured a glass of water onto the floor, just inches from the dehydrated mother's grasping hand. "You want water?" The on-screen Bongcha sneered, her voice amplified through the dining room speakers. "Sign the papers, old witch. Sign them or dry up and blow away." In the dining hall, the real Bongcha's smile didn't just fade, it shattered. She gasped, lurching up from her chair, her face draining of all color. "Master, it's a fabrication. A deep fake." Ryu didn't look at the screen. He stared only at her. "Sit down," he roared, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Bongcha collapsed back into her chair. The video continued. It shifted to a new clip, Sandra entering the room. The mood in the video changed instantly from horror to holiness. The room watched as the thief gently lifted the starving woman, feeding her bone broth with the tenderness of a daughter. Ryu turned off the projector. The darkness in the room felt heavy, suffocating. He placed his hands on the table and leaned forward, his eyes scanning the faces of the kitchen staff, the maids, the guards. "My mother was being tortured," Ryu said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Starved. In a house full of servants. In a house full of people I'd pay to protect her." He pulled a gun from his holster and set it on the table with a heavy clack. "I will ask this only once. Who else knew?" Two sous chefs and a maid tried to run, but the security team was faster. The heavy double doors burst open, and the traitorous staff members were dragged out, their desperate pleas for mercy silenced by the sharp, efficient commands of the guards. Ms. Bongcha didn't scream. She simply looked at Ryu with dead, hateful eyes as she was hauled away, the illusion of her authority shattering like the glass she had poured out on the screen. Then, silence returned to the grand dining hall. Ryu dismissed the remaining loyalists with a weary wave of his hand. They filed out quickly, eager to escape the suffocating gravity of the room, leaving the Mafia boss and the cook alone in the vast, chandelier-lit space. Sandra remained frozen in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric of her work pants. She watched Ryu holster his gun. He looked suddenly smaller, the terrifying aura of the Kkangpae boss draining away to reveal a man hollowed out by grief and shame. He walked toward her slowly. Sandra's breath hitched, and she instinctively flinched, leaning back in her seat. Ryu stopped immediately. He looked down at his own hands, scarred, wrapped in dark, serpentine ink, instruments of violence that had built an empire but failed to protect the one person who mattered. Then he looked at Sandra's hands. They were rough from years of chopping and scrubbing, stained with turmeric and beet juice, yet they possessed a strength and gentleness he had never known. "I broke men's fingers for less than what she did," Ryu said, his voice cracking, devoid of its usual steel. "I thought power was protection. I thought if I was feared enough, she would be safe. But I was useless." To Sandra's shock, the most feared man in the city didn't offer her money to buy her silence. He didn't offer a promotion to buy her loyalty. He sank to his knees on the cold marble floor. He bowed his head, his expensive Italian suit straining against his posture of absolute surrender. Tears dripped from his face, spotting the stone. "Please," he rasped, unable to look her in the eye. "I don't know how to be the son she needs. I only know how to be this." He gestured vaguely to the gun, the room, himself. Teach me how to take care of her. Teach me how to be gentle." Sandra looked at the man kneeling before her. She saw the monster the world feared, but she also saw a lost boy who had almost missed the chance to say goodbye. The fear in her chest uncoiled, replaced by a profound, quiet understanding. She reached out, her hand hesitant at first, and rested it on his shoulder. "Get up, Ryu," she said softly, using his name for the first time. "We have to go make her some soup." Ryu looked up, hope warring with his shame. He nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. He stood, not as her master, but as her student. He wasn't her boss anymore, and she wasn't his servant. They were family now, bound together by a secret bone broth and a promise to keep the light burning in the West Wing.